So let me say, it's a great pleasure to be here at UCR. I've known Ariel and admired him for many years, from the beginning of our careers jointly, and I'm delighted to be back. I've known Kurt and some of the other colleagues here when you were in the program. Exactly.
I have
yes.
also a story about you and the study, but I will not tell you.
And he will also tell you that wearing a tie is something that's, he thinks it's not out of character. I moved to Phoenix 7 years ago, and today, if I were in Phoenix, I wouldn't be wearing a tie, but it would be closer to 100 degrees. So if you woke an economist up in the middle of the night in a deep sleep anywhere in the world, any economist, a macroeconomist, a game theorist, and you asked him, what should we do with water? He would say, water marketing, and go promptly back to. So every economist knows that. And this, I know most of you are not economists, and I'm glad, and I look forward to your comments. But my thinking is oriented towards economists. And I want to argue they think wrongly about water markets in several ways. So this grows out of work. I've looked at the history of surface water rights in California. I served as the economic staff briefly of the Water Rights Agency. I'm collaborating with Mike Young in Australia. There's several, so economists say you should have water marketing, and that's true, but that completely misunderstands the reason why we don't have it. There's sort of an assumption that if things don't happen, that's just a result of oversight, stupidity, ignorance, but often it's a result of serving someone's interest. The point is, more than almost anything else, water is really political. And that means you need skill in figuring out political solutions. Just thinking about this as an economic issue and not an issue in public policy and politics is inadequate. But I'm also going to argue that some aspects of water markets need to receive more attention. So let me, and also, I'm linking water rights and reform of water rights with water markets. Because particularly for water, before you can have a water market, the water rights have to be in a state that facilitates water marketing. Often that's not the case. In fact, I'd argue the reason we have trade in the Western states, mainly in leases, one-year leases, the reason we have short-term one reflects problems with water rights, problems that rule out longer-term leases not rule out, but limit longer-term transfers. And so the issue, the constraint that blocks having more and more effective water markets is a failure to solve the political constraints. Avinash Dixit is an economic theorist, very famous professor at Princeton, has written books on the theory of economics, the theory of trade policy, international trade policy, tariffs, and so on. In 1995, he wrote a book on the political economy of economic policy. And he says, as I quote here, an economic policy problem is merely the beginning of a process that is political at every stage. That's true of international trade policy. Think of what's going on between the US and China. It's even more true, I'd say, of water policy. And water marketing, above all, involves a process of many steps, and it's a political act. And it needs a political strategy and a political coalition to come about. And that's obvious To those of you who work in the real world, it's more than obvious to Ariel, this has been his life in the World Bank, but it's not obvious to most economists, including many who write on water. And so that's what I want to emphasize. As will become clear, and you'll see more examples, the issue is really a failure to agree on reforms, a failure to agree to change things. And a failure in California of the legislature and the governor to intervene decisively. Now, I'd say Jerry Brown was different in 1976 and in 2000 in his administration, but he's the only governor since 1913, only governor in California, who I think expended political capital on water rights. Obviously, his father expended capital on the state water project. But on water rights, no governor since the governor in 1913 has spent capital. And it shows. What has happened is the politicians' mantra is, we want the water users to work things out. We'll give them time, let them work things out. And what happens is, they can't work things out. 2019 is an anniversary, it's a centenary. It's a centenary of the first water litigation involving the Delta. The first lawsuit was in 1919 when Antioch sued water users in the Sacramento Valley for taking water. It was a dry year, the seawater came in, and Antioch had to shut down its water intake for what was then a small town for 3 weeks. The judge dismissed the case. But that disagreement in California has gone on for a century now with no resolution. Now, most economists influenced by costs talk about transaction costs and emphasize how transaction costs are an impediment to bargaining. And that's true. But what I want to argue is that the transaction costs are not the problem. The underlying problem is conflict of interest. I want something that you don't want, and you want something that I want you not to have. And you and I are at odds. And that is the underlying problem. Now, if the governor, if a higher level authority, the legislature intervene, this would get settled. Because the higher level authorities in California don't want to spend political capital, they stay out of it. Because they stay out of it, we are disagreeing. We've been doing this for 100 years. Now, economists will say, well, why not bargain? The simple answer, based on my observation, is I'm not going to bargain. You're a son of a bitch. You have rights that I think are illegitimate. I'm not going to accept your right and bargain within your rights. I'm going to keep stamping my foot to lessen your right and to increase mine. And that can go on for a century. Let me skip the bargaining. Let me talk about water marketing. So I want to deal with some observations. The first question is, what good do water markets do? And there are three possible answers. There may be more, but these are three. One is long-run reallocation. You have urban population, of whatever, 40-something million in California. 20 years ago, it was much smaller. We need to move water from agricultural use to urban use. We have a population in Southern California that we didn't have 50 years ago. We need to get water from Northern to Southern California. We have climate change that's going to reduce water supplies in various ways. That's what I mean by long-run reallocation. At the other extreme, you have short-run flexibility. It's a dry year this year. I'm growing crops which are extra water sensitive. Ariel is growing crops that are not so sensitive. He doesn't need all his allotment in July. I need more than I'm allotted in July. So we'd like to swap. That's what I mean by short-run flexibility. Those are the two major roles that economists focus on. I'll mention what may seem an odd role, and it's not relevant here, but in developing countries, you have water vendors, you have wealthier farmers drilling wells for groundwater in northwest India, then selling some of the water to their neighbors who can't afford to drill a well. What's going on there is water marketing is providing a substitute for the more conventional networked infrastructure, the big projects, urban or irrigation, which are too hard to finance. And so particular water vendors on a small scale are financing and selling water. That's very important, as I say, in many developing countries. It's not really an issue for the US. Now, one of the questions that hasn't really been addressed a lot by economists is, which of the two major roles, short-run flexibility or long-run reallocation, is water marketing serving at present? I mean, it can do both. Both are good things. I would argue that most of the economics literature assumes, from the way the literature is structured, that what's going on is long-run reallocation. I would argue that most of what is happening here and in Australia is short-run flexibility. It's a good thing. It's not bad. But it raises the question of how we will accomplish the long-run reallocation if that's not being served largely by water marketing at present. Another conceptual matter. Water marketing means different things to different people and can be different things. From neighbors sharing water in a hot month to selling water in Australia. You go online, it's like buying or selling shares. Everything is, it's a formal market, arm's length transactions, and so on. And so you have everything, you have a whole range of things. Are these the same phenomena or they're different? Obviously, surface features are different. Should we think of them as the same? Economists have offered, or some economists offer a distinction and say some are not really markets. If you know, this is like it's late at night, I'm baking a cake, I run out of butter, I run round to you in the next apartment and say, can you lend me some butter? And you say, sure. And I either say, okay, this costs $2 at Safeway, here's $2, or I say, I'll give you some butter back tomorrow morning. So the seller's not making a profit. So some economists distinguish when the seller is making a profit, that's a real market, and when the seller's not making a profit, it's not a real market. I don't think that's a useful distinction. An exchange is being made. There are what economists call gains from trade. They're divided up between the seller and the buyer, and people, both parties, at least one of the parties is better off. So I'm going to not distinguish between degrees of formality. I think the crucial distinction is between short-term, temporary, one-year leases and longer-term ones. So in California, anything for a year or less is called temporary, and anything for more than a year is not temporary. So that's the basic distinction. What I'd argue is short-term leases provide flexibility. I need water this month or this season, and I get it. But it's just for this month or this season. Long-run leases or permanent sales are a part of long-run reallocation. That's the significance of this distinction between two economic roles. So the first thing to say is that around the world, water markets, in my broad definition, occur in lots of places all the time. They are, as I say here, seamless. There are three conditions that have to be satisfied for water marketing to be seamless. And when these three conditions are not satisfied, then they're problematical. The three conditions are three things. There has to be good physical connectivity, so the water can move from point A to point B. But then the property rights has to be what I call unentangled. It has to be acceptable. There has to be no question from the community. It's not just a legal issue, it's a social issue. If people if people who can intercede and block things start complaining, that's when you run into problems. If these are well accepted, if the idea that I sell to you is perfectly well accepted, and there's no financial hang-up, then these occur. When does that happen? Within retail districts, within wholesale districts. Groundwater sales by farmers to their neighbors, water vendors in certain traditional systems like the Warrabandi water sharing or the Connect system. These happen all the time because they meet these conditions. I'm going to focus on the conditions 2 and 3. The greater the physical distance between seller and buyer, the more likely that 2 and 3 are going to start being a problem. So I'm focusing on what happens when 2 and 3 are not met. I'm going to tell you a quick story about water rights in California and other Western states, and then I'm going to contrast that with water rights in Australia. This is a way of making my point that it's the property rights that impede water marketing in California and Western states, or limiting to temporary short-run exchanging. And it's changing property rights in Australia that have permitted the trading that is taking place in the Murray-Darling Basin over the last 10 years. Many of you are water professionals, you know about water. Standard textbooks say, I want to point out some odd features about the water rights. So, first of all, water right is considered real property. It's something I own, just like I own land or my house. And therefore, in principle, if government regulation interferes with it, that would violate the takings clause, or that would require compensation under the takings clause. Now, the application of the takings clause to water in California and other Western states is a complex issue, but it raises the takings clause because this is my property. And the American Constitution sort of guarantees life and liberty and, in effect, property, a secure title to property. So that's the first entanglement. We started in California with common law, with riparian rights. We abandoned them. Let me just say a couple of words about riparian rights. Riparian right is a very imprecise sharing because it says everybody who owns riparian land is land adjacent to a stream. Everybody who owns that land has an equal right. So if there's 30% less flow this year, how much do I take? How much do you take? There's no specific quantity. There's no mechanism, except I can sue everybody else along the stream if I want, and eventually, in the fullness of time, a judge will rule well after the summer has passed. So it's a very imprecise sharing. In fact, it's like being tenants in common. And any of you who have been a tenant in common will know what a messy state of existence that is. Why does that work? Well, it works if there's lots of water around. And so being vague about how it's divided up isn't a problem. It does not work where there's not lots of water around. For example, west of the 100th meridian or in the interior in Australia. It doesn't work when you want to do hydraulic mining because you didn't own the land, and often the mining operation wasn't adjacent to the stream. And as you know, California invented a different right, the appropriative right, copied from rules developed in the mining camps in California. And so the appropriative right has a strict rule of sharing. The senior person gets all of his, and the junior person gets only of this. So it's orderly about that. There are other features of the appropriative right, as it was developed in California, that are highly disorderly. So let me remind you, how did this work? To take a riparian right, in addition to a shovel, and you needed 3 things piece of paper, a pencil, and a stick or a tree. I guess 4 things. You needed a nail. And you wrote your name, the date, including the day of the week and so on, and the amount of water on the piece of paper, and you attached the paper to a nearby tree or to a stick which you placed in the ground. That was the record of water use. Sometimes it's windy, sometimes it rains. The pieces of paper haven't survived. With them is gone the records of who was claiming a water right. There was no centralized recording. There was no recording period except on dispersed trees and sticks of papers. If there was a disagreement, the only dispute resolution mechanism was suing in courts. That was the only way of figuring things out. So the miners did things better, and this is not widely realized. The miners had a system which water didn't. What was the system? First of all, if Ariel was impinging on my claim, we would see that because he would be digging in maybe a 15-foot by 15-foot area right next to where I was digging in a 15-foot by 15-foot area. I would know Ariel was at work and he'd know I was at work. With a river, Ariel could be 50 miles from me or 100 miles. I'd have no idea and he'd have no idea. Without central, in other words, with mining, you didn't need central record keeping about a neighbor. You could see the neighbor. But the miners had what were called mining camps. And the mining camps, there were about 150 in California, they kept record. They knew who was doing what, and they would dispute resolution. So if Ariel didn't shoot me before we had a claim, we'd go to the mining camp, we'd each make a pitch, and they would decide who was right. So there was dispute resolution and there was enforcement through the local mining camp. None of those things existed for water under prohibitive water rights at first. So the result was a high degree of chaos. Remember, the water right is the maximum right you can get. So people were optimistic. This was a young country. People had visions of the future. It was only human nature to exaggerate, to write down not the amount you were taking in 1862, but the amount that with your children and grandchildren you sort of hoped they would take. And so the result was claims within 20 or 30 years for 10, in one case 50 times more stream flow than had been experienced. In other words, these were all bogus claims. The only way, as I say, to resolve these things was private litigation. Judges were easily fooled, knew nothing about hydrology. The result was rulings that were massively inconsistent and chaotic. That was the system we invented in California. We can feel proud. Other states have mining booms, people rush in, they need water, they copy the California system. So the difference is we kept riparian rights. They essentially eliminated riparian rights from the beginning. But their appropriative rights was the same system as bits of paper, sticks, pencils, and they had the same degree of chaos. The difference is they lost patience with this, and after 10, 20 years, moved to reform the system, to set up centralized record keeping, to create a small staff on the ground who would go around and enforce seniority, make sure people were taking the amount, not more, and if there was a shortage, that priority was being enforced. Some of them set up administrative agencies. Colorado created a court system. When they made these changes, they grandfathered the pre-existing rights. But then, after a while, they undid the grandfathering and brought the pre-existing rights into a centralized system with records and some sort of enforcement on the ground. California was slow to act. We sort of acted in 1872, but we left the system as it was, basically until 1914. 1914 is 60 years after appropriate diversions had been occurring in California. A huge amount of water was being claimed. a huge amount had been used, an even huger amount had been claimed. And we grandfathered the pre-existing pre-1914 rights. It's 105 years later, and they're still grandfathered. We haven't exempted the grandfathering. So this compares Colorado with California. And it shows how California started 10 years after California, but by 1920, it had things shipshape. California, 2019, things are not shipshape. What do I mean by not shipshape? I mean rights are entangled. I have an 1870 right. I want to sell it to Ariel. Kurt intervenes and says Hanemann is selling water he doesn't own. How much water do I own? Well, that depended on what was diverted in 1872, and the bit of paper, unfortunately, is no longer with us. So can I sell the water to Ariel? Who knows? The rule now is if I can prove the water I am leasing temporarily to Ariel is an amount I've used for the last 5 years, I can go ahead and do that. That's why so many transfers in California are short-term leases, because I don't have to prove what I claim I have owned or acquired with an 1872 right. So how are things entangled? First of all, the entanglement arises because of return flows. Ariel or Kurt needs my return flows. The return flows, how much are they? How much do I have to put back in the river? Well, in theory, we have to figure out what my predecessor was putting back in the river in 1872. This is theoretical. Now, so Colorado has a sleek system. You only have a right to the consumptive use. Good. In Colorado, you still have to prove what the consumptive use. It's not just enough to prove what the consumptive use is. I have to prove how much of the non-consumptive use was return flow and where in the river it showed up as return flow in 1872. And that becomes a huge litigation battle with lawyers and hydrologists. We all agree the guy was growing potatoes, 10 acres of potatoes in 1872. We all agree what the consumptive use of potatoes was in 1872. Who knows where the hell the return flow showed up exactly downstream? That has to be determined with precision, and sales can be blocked unless you can prove that with precision. But there are other things. There's financial. So a large fraction of the irrigation investment in the United States went bankrupt. I mean, I think, let's say half. The physical assets remained. They were taken over, and they're used to this day. But the original investors lost their shirt. New entities came along, often irrigation districts, sometimes mutuals. They acquired the assets. They borrowed debt. The assets moved generally from individual ownership to organizational ownership. And so the water rights came predominantly to belong to irrigation districts of various forms. And so now the right belongs to the district. If you want to sell the water, that's nice, but it belongs to the district. You may have neighbors who'd like to use the water. Besides, the district may have indebtedness which it's paying off, and it pays off by charging volumetric charges for water. If you want to not pay, how's the district, how your neighbor's going to pay the debt? So there are financial entanglements as well as property right entanglements. And then there's this stuff that in California, the water belongs to the peoples of California. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So let me stop for a moment. So during the 2000 drought, I said if you wake any economist in the middle of the night and say what to do about water marketing, what to do about water, he'll say water marketing. So this is a Stanford labor economist, presumably awake when writing this, foaming at the mouth in the Wall Street Journal, in the op-ed page, about what California was screwing up during the drought. And he says, if people would be willing to pay for these rights, let them trade. Why are we stopping it? It's government controls. It's environmental lawsuits. That's what's causing the problem in California. That's what's making the drought such a pain. To solve our problems, just let the owners of water sell their water. If you want environmental protection, pay for it. Just let the owners of the water do their thing. Okay? Sounds very persuasive. The only thing is, it's totally nuts. The people who use water don't own the water. And we have environmental legislation on the books. And if you want to repeal the laws, be my guest, go ahead and do that. But as long as the laws are on the book, you can't pretend they don't exist. That's the point. Now, a key issue, I mentioned this with Riparian. You have seniority of rights, so that gets rid of some of the imprecision. But God forbid if you want to transfer your right, change the point of diversion or the place of use. Then, and this is true in all the Western water codes, you have to not cause harm to other water users. It's the no injury rule. Now, and if an economist ruled the world, he might say, do a cost-benefit test, do a balancing. If the benefits of the transfer are large and the harm to some other person is small, what the hell? Go ahead and do it. Do a balancing. That's not the way the law works. It's the no harm rule, which becomes an imprecise form of sharing. It has to be decided in principle in every case, because who knows what the harm is going to be a matter of empirical facts. So people talk about water marketing in Colorado in the particular project, the Colorado Big Thompson project. Huge amount of water marketing. It turns out it's not governed by prior appropriation. That's water diverted, appropriated from the Colorado River on the west slope of the Rockies, put through a tunnel through the Rocky Mountains for use on the east. It's no longer under prior appropriation. The business of no injury rule applied to the diversion. Now, through good fortune, this is an area with a population of 1 million people in the suburbs of Denver. So it's a great location. But this is not water governed by prior appropriation. It's not like the rest of surface water in Colorado. And so the easy trading illustrates exactly my point. That water is unentangled. You have trading. The rest of surface water in Colorado is entangled by the points I've mentioned. That's why the trades are very complicated. Another issue I alluded to, under the California law, there's a public interest in water. The State Water Board can only approve giving a permit and transferring a permit if it's in the public interest. The public interest has broadened, particularly over the last 4 decades, to mean lots of things, including the public trust doctrine. Again, you don't own that anymore. So it's like you want to sell your car to somebody, you can sell a car. Nobody has to come along and say, is it in the public interest for Hanemann to sell his car to Dina? No, it's not the public's business. This is water. Again, you can disapprove this. That's fine. You either have to change it, though, which has not been possible so far, or work with it. Joe Sachs, the late Joe Sachs, wrote one thing that you shouldn't think of water marketing as like buying shares in IBM. You open the Wall Street Journal and you find the price, you call the broker, you say, I want 100 shares, end of story. Oh, you go online, it's even faster. He said water markets, except for temporary, are like diplomatic negotiations. With many, it's not just a seller and a buyer, it's all these other people who have an interest. And as I keep saying, you can disapprove of this, but if you can't extinguish other people's interest, this is the system we have. Quickly, Australia. Australia started out with Riparian, had a gold discovery in the 1840s, I think, created appropriative rights. The gold played out. They went back to Riparian. What were they using the water for? Mainly pasture, sheep. And the sheep moved around. If you have a drought here but not there, not a problem, the sheep. When did it stop being a problem? Or start being a problem? 1880s, the population has grown, you need food, you need farms, more intensive agriculture. Now the riparian right is no longer reliable. They send Victoria sends a parliamentary commission to India and to the US, both former British colonies, both with common law, with riparian rights. The Deakin Commission reports in 1886 what is happening in California is a total mess and is to be avoided. Victoria, therefore, changes the legal system. What it does is nationalize water rights. What do I mean by that? Water is no longer real property. Water, you get water by a permit from a bureaucrat in a government office, subject to conditions, revocable if the bureaucrat or if Parliament acts a law. You no longer own it in the way in America, riparian or appropriative right is real property. No constitutional ban on taking, but again, it's not yours. It belongs to the government at the discretion of the government entirely. And also, as it happens in the 60s and 70s, they got rid of figuring out how much water did potatoes use in 1872. They changed these things to something like an acre-foot an acre, period. So they quantified the rights. This is before water marketing really gets going in Australia, before there's much of a crisis that gets going. And then in a paper I'm finishing up, I'll pass over this briefly, with Mike Young, who was the guru of water marketing in Australia. We go through the stages in the 1990s, then in the early 2000s, and then after 2010, where Australia made reforms to water rights, turned them into shares, as opposed to rights to an amount of water, percentage shares, made them tradable, prevented districts from blocking trades outside the district, and so on. And so a crucial question, in Australia, like the US, water rights belong to the states, not to the federal government. But by 2004 in Australia, there was a sense that the 5 states, particularly the 3 major ones, were doing a lousy job of working out. So there's an there's an interstate river, the Murray-Darling Basin. The states have been managing it since 1913. They're not agreeing. Different states have different interests, do different things. One state is willing to promote water marketing, another one is really quite hostile to water marketing. The federal government intervenes on the grounds that this is a national problem. It's in the national interest to fix it. The states are dragging their feet. The federal government injects itself. Why is the federal government able to do that in Australia and not here? Partly is a curious freak reason which benefited Australia, but not the US. And it's important enough, I'll take a couple of minutes to tell you. There was a malaise in Australia in the 1980s, a feeling that Australia was falling behind among the great economic powers of the world. And that could be that a major part of its economy was agricultural and the world was changing. Also, you had South Korea coming, Australia at the time was maybe the 8th largest economy in the world. But there was a sense it was going to go down in the rankings. It wasn't going to stay 8th. And that created so much angst that the federal government created a royal commission to look at the problem of competitiveness in Australia, or rather the inadequacy. It was framed as a lack of competitiveness. And that led to national legislation, the National Competition Act, I want to say 2002, and the creation of the Australian Competitiveness Council. And that's a remarkable, one other thing. The Act said, where you have enterprise agencies that are public agencies, like a water department or a sewer department or a parking operator, those have to be divested. They have to be run as private companies with the same bookkeeping requirements and accounting of a private company. They can be owned by the city. They can be owned publicly. They have to be run not as governments. They have to be run as businesses with accounting, depreciation, transparent pricing, and whatever. And the Australian Competitiveness Council can intervene, can do a probe, and can require changes of federal agencies, state agencies, and local agencies. And so the ACC swooped that Melbourne water rates were badly designed, or that Perth was doing a bad job with its water investment. It reached that conclusion. It directed those bodies to change what they're doing. This came out of left field, but has been a very powerful agent for change in Australia, and very active in promoting water marketing, preventing water districts from blocking out-of-district sales, reviewing how much water districts can charge if a member wants to sell the water out of the district. It has completely recast things. Let me skip this. I want to, so a couple of things. There's a bunch of questions. Let me quickly, if you're going to have water marketing, do you have to first put a cap on the amount of water being used? And do you have to allocate that cap among the users? In theory, the answer is yes. In practice, that's often not happened. Why does it not happen? You need the water users to agree both to the total cap and to the allocation of water. We have adjudication lawsuits in the US that have taken 15 years, 20 years. Right. Getting agreement to how you divvy up, what's the total and how do you divvy up, can be a hellacious process. That's one thing. Suppose you don't do that. You decide, what the hell, we'll just allow water mining. Then you can have people selling water they have never used. Is that a problem? Yes. If you were introducing water marketing to limit the amount of water, or let alone reduce it, it's going to be a problem that people, but in other words, you would really need to first work out the limit and the allocations. Otherwise, water marketing isn't going to work. That's what I'm saying on this slide. So what actually happens in the U.S., in the Western U.S., is you have, and this is very relevant to the groundwater legislation and the implementation, which is saying, do you actually have to measure the amount of water being used? Some districts want water marketing but don't want to measure water use. What's happening is much less tidy than what economists think of when they think of water. Which raises the question, is a market the best interest? Maybe, see, it's politically easier to impose a limit or to impose a charge on water diversions than it is to set up water marketing. I'm saying in practice in many cases. And so that's relevant for deciding what to do. Very quickly, I want to talk about just a few more slides. In California so far, in terms of formal water markets, not informal ones within districts, about 250 entities have sold water. If you look at the database on surface water rights in California, there are 35,000 water rights. Now, it's very possible that certain people own many water rights, so I have no idea. So this is 250 water rights holders out of how many? We don't know at this point. This is research I'm undertaking. Presumably they're large ones. How large, what percent of the water under rights? I have no idea at this point, and nobody else knows. Let me show you, this is the crucial data. This is the percent, this is the southern Murray-Darling, which is where there are active water markets, as opposed to the northern basin, mainly around the Darling River. This is the percent of people who have sold short-term leases, temporary transfers, the blue line, or permanent sales, the orange line. Water marketing started in 1981, 1982. For almost 20 years, less than whatever, 3-4% had participated. It then takes off. It then takes off. Why? What happened? So first of all, the early period, this is like California and most of the Western US right now. And the real question is, what has to happen for us to get to the right-hand side? Now, Australia had reforms of water law, and I've given you a very, very brief description of them. But I've explained Australia started reforming its laws in the 1980s with a different legal system which was friendlier to changes than we have. Australia had a major, major drought. We've had that on the Colorado River. In 2006, the allocation of water during the season fell to less than 10% of normal. In Australia, water, I say allocation, how much you get is announced week by week, not for the whole season, because hydrologic conditions change. The worst week, I think the allowance was 6% of what would be normal. They responded through water market purchase. The loss in agricultural production was very small, I think on the order of 10-12%. So you have basically 90% less water in the middle of the season. It's done overwhelmingly with short-term transfers. Australia has a balanced agriculture with pasture and in the Murray-Darling Basin, and particularly with grapes, which are high value. But the pasture folks sold to the grape growers. As you know, in California, we have moved increasingly to tree crops. So one question is, do we have the same sort of balance? I'll end here. So one question is, who was selling in the early days? Who was selling in the later days? What factors explain economic, political, agronomic, the joining the market? What factors explain this transition? And then, of course, the question is, what would it take for this to happen here? But I would, and I'm not saying, obviously, that things are the same here as in Australia, but I'm saying, so most of the economic analyses of marketing assume that if marketing were to happen, everybody would participate. But that's not true for two reasons. One reason is this, not everybody. But the other is, and you had this with SO2 market, sulfur dioxide. About 80% of the reduction in sulfur dioxide didn't involve SO2 marketing. People reduced emissions at their power plants. You had owners with multiple power plants, with multiple boilers. They shuffled things around. In other words, they had internal trades, but not external trades through the market. That's great. I'm not complaining. But the existing economic projections of what we gain with water marketing assume everybody sells through the market. And the point is, that's an exaggeration. I mean, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, maybe that will happen. So we really don't understand, A, how to usher markets into existence in this country, given the legal impediments. And B, we don't really understand how markets evolve in terms of who chooses to participate and sell water, what motivates the choice, what determines the timing. Thank you. Yes, it was why water marketing was resisted. It was why first states wouldn't allow you to sell water outside the state. It was why districts wouldn't allow you to sell water outside the district. States wouldn't allow you to sell. The National Competition Act trumped that. It said our national competitiveness requires interstate marketing and so on. But there's one other angle. So much of the permanent sales in Australia came through environmental water purchases. And the Australian government put up, I think, $3.5 billion, something like that, to buy water. And got going on a substantial scale in 2012 on this scale. It got shut down about 2015, 2016, because farmers didn't like the idea of the government using taxpayers' money to buy water to put it in the river. The majority of the federal money went to finance improvements in irrigation efficiency, and that has continued. And that was one way of the notion of getting there. But economists in Australia who have analyzed this said the investment in irrigation efficiency was a waste. It didn't put more water in the river. You had what's called a rebound effect. And in fact, there isn't evidence of more water in the river. I mean, it's clear the real story, I think, would be things would have gone worse if they hadn't done what they did. But at this point, it's not clear that things are back to, have improved to where they wanted. And political concerns about equity and so on were very important. But then you come back to this trade-off: do we want to restore the river ecosystem, and are we going to do so?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Just some comments.
Yes.
And, also, in China, the market was not so successful, and compared to California, I think it's two different cases. Australia probably in the middle. In China, the government intervention too many, so that means the transaction cost is very high.
Yes.
But also because of the different levels of the government. So now, although it's proposed for about 20 years, not so many trade happen.
Yeah.
And in California cases, I think several issues on cost. Just as you mentioned, the rights system is a problem because you have a priority. So it's very difficult to go into the market pricing. In Australia, they have two priority group or three priority group. In each group, the right is the same. So the price will be the same in the market, but not in the California. You have the ranking system. That's I think the key, the root of the market. And the second one that I think is that California probably, because of this, I think the protection of the property rights is too strong. So that means I always discuss with Ali about, can you have a revolution of your water rights in California? You say no. Also the government structure and government structure. And also another reason is about, just I'm thinking about the climate condition, the
Yes.
weather condition. Because you have a extreme weather, winter with precipitation, but most of the agricultural water use is in the summertime. So that's puts the risk on the water trade, and probably farmers were not willing to sell it because they are losing. And also the crop park. California has all the time, I think, a lot of rules that's multiple years. You cannot sell. You should hold it for at least 5 years or 10 years. But in Australia, some dairy farmers and also the wheat farmers, cotton farmers, they can grow for 1 year and then plant the next year. So, but I still think that the groundwater trade in Southern California is quite successful.
Oh, very. But it's the farming areas, not the adjudicated.
Yeah, not adjudicated. In Southern California, some groundwater or water basins, they have a very good marketing actually, and also the total review is down and down. And thank you very much.
So it takes a crisis to change. Australia's crisis was the economic competitiveness. Maybe we should worry about that also, but anyhow, we don't. It may be climate change. So I worked on climate change in California with the Energy Commission for 8 years. And the system of water rights is a major vulnerability to California, to climate change. And it will need some, this is, We don't know who's using water. We don't have, you can't, suppose stream flow goes down 20%. How do you reallocate if you, but it will need some sense of crisis. So what I'm saying is it's not enough to say we can use water, an economist will say if you have water marketing, you'll be better off and you'll live happily ever after. That's not enough. It needs something else. We don't have the competitiveness crisis. We've got to have, it's going to take something like that. And let me say so the joke I say, it turned out, I found the historical record. In 1942, California's chief water lawyer proposed what's called an adjudication of the Central Valley rivers. The court procedure, bring everybody who claims to have a water right before a judge. It's a trial. In Idaho, it took 20 years. But then you figured this out. And the judge has flexibility to change rights, to even institute a percentage right instead of an absolute right, or to get rid of the fine-grained ranking and to put rights in a bucket together. That was resisted. There has been no adjudication in California. Because the water users don't want to be regulated. They're the ones who kill. But going into the future with climate change, we need something like that. And it may be that climate is how we'll get there. So, this is my point. It needs a sufficient political crisis. Australia had it with competitiveness. So I like to say I'm an optimist. I believe strongly that by 2100, California will fix these problems. And the only problem is I have no idea how soon before 2100 that will happen.
My last question.
What about the firestorms, like Jerry Ruskin, you out like in Malibu and that paradise, that place was just all of, and isn't that enough of a crisis that like 500 people live?
No, one thing so I mentioned to you, so a paradox is I wrote this history about California in the book chapter, and I called it California's Dysfunctional Water Rights. And I showed this chapter to Hap Dunning, a law professor of Davis, who I admire enormously. And he said, that's a terrible title, the system isn't dysfunctional, it's functioning. And this is the point, it is functioning, it's functioning badly. It's like being terribly sick, where you can barely walk around, you can barely move, you're alive, but you. So the people involved in it are kind of used to it, and it's functioning, and they'll put up with it. And it's really only strangers from a distance who say, my God, you're a total wreck. You're barely alive, and you can't put up with this. So we have acceptance, because people live with this somehow, day in and day out, and the question is how to penetrate that acceptance.
Okay, so
Thank you.
I had a question, but for the interest of time,
Yes.
I will ask it later.
Yes.
So thank you very much for coming. Thank you very
Thank
much
you.
for coming.